Good morning. So this is Phil Macnaghten speaking, and I'm delighted to be talking to a paper which Michel Habets, who's my co-author, and I wrote, Breaking the Impasse Towards a Forward-Looking Governance Framework for Gene Editing with Plants. So I'm delighted that both to be giving this paper, this hot paper, at the ICAR 2021 conference, and in particular to be talking as a nominated paper through this really innovative journal, Plants, People, Planet. And what's interesting for me as a social scientist is this interface really between plant science, sustainability, the environment, and in particular society or people. So I'm talking about the context in which we wrote this paper and to some details on that. So what we do? So what we do in this paper is, first of all, we review some social science scholarship. We draw some lessons. What can we learn from the public controversy around GM crops and foods? And what does that mean for gene editing? Second, we describe the European policy debate on gene editing with plants and how it's been framed by dominant actors. Third, we review some solutions other countries have sought and this level-based approval system that Norway is proposing, which we think is particularly interesting. And fourth, we introduce frameworks of responsible innovation as providing kind of a toolkit really for how to align innovation, particularly technological innovation, with societal values. So the context for this, well, the context, we all know there's a really pressing food security context. We need to feed a growing world population, and at the same time there's lots of other demands on land, and there are different kind of ways of doing this. And in the paper we look at what we call sustainable intensification approaches, with a prominent role for novel biotechnologies, and agroecological approaches, which have a different kind of tradition for how to engage with both food sovereignty and food sovereignty dimensions. But the question we keep going back to is, well, let's see if we can learn from history and why, in particular, do GM crops evade policy resolution. And to help answer that question, we really need a better understanding of the societal dynamics such that we can help new biotechnologies avoid the polemic. So when we look at GM crops, what we learn, well, first rather obvious one as we learn is the revolutionary promises that GM crops would help feed the world, contribute towards sustainability, produce better quality food were not really reflected in practice. What occurred, the crops that developed really were designed to help the large producer, not the environment or the consumer. And that we thought was a particularly interesting and relevant lesson. Another lesson was that in terms of how we govern GM crops, there's really very little scope for public and stakeholder involvement, little consideration of societal and ethical considerations. And when we look at what concerns people, often it's not really those concerns which are thought through in terms of how it's governed. It's not really about technological risk issues. So it's about lots of wider issues, sort of boundary issues. And the last finding is that the different regulatory regimes, particularly between Europe, the US, the rest of the world, kind of provided an opportunity structure for global societal actors to operate at the interface between governments, concerned publics, and to appeal to the technology as an imperial colonizing force. So what does this mean for the policy debate on gene-edited plants? And this is particularly poignant at the moment, not least because of CRISPR, which has made editing of the genome more precise, efficient, flexible, and less expensive. And so the key question is, how do we make sure we don't feed into the same polemic? Well, when we look at how gene editing is being thought about, how it's been configured, particularly at the policy dimension, what we see is actually there's the same kind of mobilization occurring as with the old GMO debate. There are those who think that it should be exempted from the European GMO Directive, and there are those who think it should not. And the question that we have is, well, how do we move beyond the impasse? Well, we suggest there's two broad ways which we can do this. One is we can have a more differentiated level-based approach to regulation. And second, we can think about responsible innovation as a way of working with and for society. A level-based approach, well, there's been some really interesting innovation in governance, particularly in Norway. And what has been thought about here is that you can regulate not simply in terms of the kind of level of genetic changes that are involved, even though those are particularly important, but through an assessment of broader considerations, what benefits are going to produce and for whom? How is it going to contribute to sustainability? What are the ethical dimensions? And this seems to us a particularly important way to move and broaden the debate of governance from a narrow technological discussion on risks to a level-based approach and to include these broad societal and ethical considerations. And finally, we appeal to a framework of responsible research and innovation, which is a process by which societal actors, innovators can become mutually responsive to each other to allow a proper embedding of scientific and technical advances in society. Well, we've been developing this for different kinds of technical innovations. What we suggest is for innovation to be responsible, we need to get much better at developing capacities that are going to help us anticipate impacts, where we can then include publics and stakeholders in processes of deliberation. We can cultivate reflexive cultures, and we can be responsive to these dimensions. So this was our argument. So we're saying of innovations in the plant sciences are to fulfill the potential in contributing towards grand challenges. They need to be developed with and for society. We reviewed the current debate on regulation. We found that lessons during controversy have not really to date been adequately learnt. And we've suggested ways of how to move beyond the impasse, to learn the lessons from GM crops, innovations in regulation, and innovations in research governance. So this is our paper. We hope that you will have a chance to look at it. We're delighted to be part of this session. We look forward to the discussion. And I think the take-home message is we are really hoping to cultivate or to work with plant science so that it can be not simply the promoter of technological innovations, but really an honest broker in which it can engage with and for society. So this is a paper. I want to thank you and also thank Michelle Habets, and we look forward greatly to the discussion. Thank you very much.